The snow would not leave Berlin. In the old seasons, the city's winters had been sulky, rain-soaked, peppered with sleet that clung to windshields and tram cables before dissolving at the first hint of morning light. But since the summer of 2046, after the final salvo of tactical warheads scarred the Polish plain, the very jet stream seemed to have tilted on its axis of sorrow. Now the cold settled in August and did not soften until May. Fine, colorless snow sifted through every fractured cornice, dusted every balcony of Prenzlauer Berg, drifted in doorways that had once advertised cafes and record shops. It sprouted a strange hush in the avenues, a hush that swallowed the memory of laughter, until the only punctures in the silence were the guttural hum of diesel armor and the dry crackle of loudspeakers repeating occupation decrees in accented German. Under the frozen surface, Berlin still breathed, a pump of stubborn blood, an almost dying heart. In the labyrinth below Alexanderplatz, where the abandoned U-Bahn tunnels met the service corridors of vacant theaters, a single radio mic glowed like an ember. The mic was chipped bronze, a prop from a forgotten play, its cable soldered to a scavenged transmitter whose vacuum tubes had been smuggled out of a pre-war museum. Before that microphone sat Anya Fischer, once the star of Schabern's modern classics, now 40 years old and as weathered as the city she refused to leave. When she spoke, her throat rasped with dust, yet her vowels still bore the cadence of Chekhov monologues that had sold out evenings 15 years earlier. The voice mattered more than the words, listeners said. It was the voice of memory, proof that Berlin had not yet choked on the ash of its own history. She began each midnight broadcast the same way, even on the nights when the generator protested and the snow muffled the antenna high above the ruined orchestra loft. Good evening, ghosts and dreamers. This is Radio Free Berlin, cold on the dial but warm in the marrow. If you can hear me, you are alive. Hold fast to that small mercy. The signal had always been shy, curling only a dozen kilometers through the tangle of concrete, never loud enough to stir the occupation's direction-finding vans. But 3 nights ago, a new resistor, cobbled together from the copper veins of a shattered traffic light, unlocked more power than Anya's tiny cell had anticipated. The carrier wave spilled beyond the Ringbahn, leaked across the Soviet checkpoints at Wannsee, and winked over the river into the occupied suburbs of Potsdam. On the 4th night, a voice crackled back. It belonged to a child hiding in a basement bookshop on the Kurfürstendamm, whispering about her father's arrest and her little brother's fever. Anya answered with lullabies she half remembered from her grandmother, then promised antibiotics that she did not yet possess. The call went out for volunteers to brave the patrols, and by dawn 2 strangers had agreed to meet beneath the East Side Gallery, where the river's ice groaned loud enough to mask footfalls. That expansion of hope, unsecured and unscripted, was what finally triggered the algorithms humming in the occupier's listening bureau, a glass tower transplanted from Moscow's cyber defense command into the heart of the Reichstag. Inside, technicians sifted through terabytes of intercepted chatter, searching for frequencies whose modulation did not match the official spectrum. Most pirates were sloppy teenagers who wanted to blast outlaw techno. They were caught within hours, dragged into police vans, and sentenced to silence. But the voice from beneath the theater was different. It threaded its way through a warren of dead frequencies, ducking and weaving with an elegance that suggested military training. When the technicians ran it against their database, they found no match, only a strange residue of theater acoustics and the faint echo of applause. The lead analyst, Major Svetlana Korolyova, listened twice and felt something tighten behind her ribs. Sounded like home. Then she opened a fresh file and labeled it Холодный эфир, cold ether. How had the world cracked wide enough for such a drama? History's fulcrum had shifted years earlier, on a sticky July afternoon in 2022, when columns of armored vehicles crawled across Ukraine's sunflower fields. The war spiraled, atrocities compounding like interest, until energy markets reeled and grocery shelves whispered of famine. By the time the United Nations gathered for emergency talks, Kiev's skyline flickered in the heat of rocket volleys. Yet the defenders refused to yield. Their president, Volodymyr Zelensky, appeared nightly in olive fatigues, sui generis in his refusal to abandon the capital. Across the Atlantic, America fretted and fundraisered. 2 election cycles later, the country chose nostalgia over nuance. Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, flanked by a newly minted Vice President, J.D. Vance, and an ambitious Secretary of State named Marco Rubio. In his inaugural address, the word peace arrived cuffed to strength, but the subtext was clear. Borders first, balance sheets second, alliances negotiable. By summer, Washington announced a strategic reset in Eastern Europe. Military aid to Ukraine froze. A ceasefire plan, brokered in Geneva, dangled promises of reconstructed pipelines and renewed wheat shipments. Vladimir Putin accepted the pause with the smile of a man granted one more inning. The front quieted long enough for diplomats to toast their own cleverness. What followed was not war but erosion. Each year, another sanction lifted, another treaty frayed. The European Union, coaxed by cheap Siberian gas and haunted by its own debt ceilings, allowed its defense budgets to wither. By the time the first hypersonic missile screeched across the Vistula in 2039, its interception batteries were already cannibalized for spare silicon. Nations toppled in sequence. Lithuania in 9 days, Poland in 40, Germany in less than a year after the fall of Dresden. Paris surrendered beneath a curtain of electromagnetic jamming, its monuments smudged against a gray sky as tank battalions parked along the Seine. A triad of low-yield nukes flattened uninhabited tracts of the Ardennes and the Rhine meadows, warnings rather than massacres, but enough to petrify the last pockets of resistance. The United States condemned each bombing with sterile press releases, then pivoted to Pacific trade summits. It was easier to debate tariffs than to bleed for strangers. Berlin's fall was strangely civil. The garrison Bundeswehr negotiated an orderly withdrawal. Leaving behind depots of small arms, the occupiers promptly rebranded as humanitarian aid. Checkpoints sprouted, curfews thickened, curators sealed their archives. In the boulevard shadows, a black market for stories blossomed. People craved narratives more than bread. They wanted to know why the continent had been abandoned, how their votes and taxes had incubated such ruin. The occupiers offered only slogans, so the hungry turned their ears to the fissures in the airwaves, searching for a voice that dared to speak without permission. Anya's theater was the Volksbühne, a relic of Red Stars and avant-garde manifestos. Its maroon seats sat empty now, caked in plastered dust from the artillery strike that had peeled away half the facade. In the understage storage, she and her phantom crew, a sound engineer named Otis, a graffiti artist called Len, and 2 teenage sisters who scavenged batteries from abandoned e-bikes, kept the transmitter alive with spit, solder, and improbable faith. Each dawn they stripped their workspace bare, pulling cables into flylofts and masking the antenna with a tarp painted to mimic shattered roofing tiles. Floodlights scanned the district nightly, but rarely lingered long. The occupiers avoided theaters, as though the ghosts of satire still roamed the aisles. It was after her 6th midnight monologue that the knock arrived. 3 sharp raps on the backstage fire door. Len slipped through the dark, a box cutter hidden in his palm, and cracked the door wide. Outside stood a slim man in a conductor's coat, breath ghosting in the sub-zero air. He introduced himself as Herr Keller, a former Deutsche Bahn dispatcher who now coordinated refugee trains threading their way to the Danish peninsula. He carried a transistor set tuned to Anya's frequency and a map riddled with red circles. The circles, he explained, marked orphaned repeaters, rusting broadcast towers abandoned when the cellular grids went dark. With a ladder and 30 meters of coaxial cable, he could piggyback Anya's signal from Berlin all the way to Lübeck, maybe further. The thought made Otis whistle through his teeth. More coverage, more hearts beating in unison. It also meant more risk. They argued under dim bulbs beneath the stage. Anya listened, arms folded, weighing fear against duty. She remembered the child on the Kurfürstendamm, the tremor in her voice when she thanked the radio for a lullaby. Finally, Anya raised her hand. "If a story crosses a border," she said, "it cannot be buried. Let them chase echoes." So the pact was sealed. Herr Keller vanished into the night with Len as escort, 2 shadows dragging a spool of cable on a sled fashioned from an upturned cafeteria tray. That same night, 28 kilometers southwest, Major Korolyova convened an emergency briefing. The voice, she informed her superior, had multiplied. Intercepts from Potsdam, Leipzig, and Magdeburg confirmed simultaneous reception. "It will embolden them," Koroleova warned. "Better to sever the tongue before it fashions a flag." Orders came swift. Task Force Zarya, an elite signal tracking detachment, would mobilize at first light, grid-searching the city quadrant by quadrant. Their equipment could triangulate a 5 kHz blip within minutes. Their standing rules allowed lethal force. Anya never heard the gears of those decisions turning. Yet that night, as she rehearsed her next broadcast, a cold premonition crept along her spine. She did not rewrite the script. Instead, she leaned closer to the mic, letting her breath fog the anodized grill, and recorded a message that felt more like a confession than a report. She spoke of fear, not as weakness but as a signpost pointing toward what mattered most. She spoke of the city's bones refusing to crumble, of children tracing constellations through the cracks in boarded windows, of lovers learning Morse code by candlelight so they could pulse "I miss you" across streets where words might be overheard. Her voice deepened into a timbre older than she was, a timbre that remembered bomb shelters and cabarets and the slow rebuilding after earlier ruins. When she signed off, she kept the carrier wave open for one extra heartbeat, as though expecting someone, somewhere, to answer with equal clarity. In the listening bureau, Major Koroleova closed her eyes. A memory slipped loose, her mother humming a lullaby in a Khrushchevka kitchen lit by a failing bulb. For the briefest moment, the analyst wished she could switch sides, stand beneath the stage lights, and read the city back to itself. The feeling passed. She keyed an authorization code. Task Force Zarya rolled. And above the theater, snow began again, soft as oblivion, shrouding the rooftop in a blanket so silent it seemed to erase the very notion of pursuit. The frost lattice dawned after Anya's confession broke like a cracked mirror, slicing the horizon into pale fragments of mauve and steel. Berlin stirred beneath its armor of ice, but nothing felt ordinary. In the half-light, every siren seemed nearer, every footfall suspiciously deliberate. The Volksbund sub-basement, once a sanctuary of whispered jokes and salda smoke, now vibrated with a raw current of urgency. Otis crouched beside the generator, coaxing reluctant sparks from a jerry-rigged magneto while Len scanned the staircase with binoculars that lacked one eye cup. The sisters Inga and Marta shuttled crates of spare batteries upriver through a trench of toppled scenery flats, their woolen caps bright as smuggled poppies in the gloom. Anya herself had slept no more than an hour, curled atop a heap of moth-chewed costumes that still stank of stage lights. She rose when Keller returned at sunrise, boots crusted with hoarfrost, hair ribboned by wind. He spread his map across a cracked vanity mirror, sunlight skating over the glass like searchlights on black water. 2 repeaters online, he whispered, tapping circles near Oranienburg and Ludwigsfeld. Coverage to the Havelland. By tonight we can reach Rostock. The news should have tasted of triumph, yet some instinct older than training, older even than fear, convinced Anya that expansion had outpaced caution. She hooked a strand of hair behind an ear and leaned over the map. "We need a failsafe," she muttered. "If they trace one tower, the whole lattice must not unravel." Keller nodded and produced a bundle of copper jumpers, delicate as violin strings. "Frequency hopping," he said. "Every 7 minutes. Old resistance trick from the Balkan nets. But it means someone has to ride shotgun on the timing crystal." Len volunteered. He was 18, a graffiti laureate of abandoned S-Bahn bridges, his knuckles scarred by winter railings. He would pedal a rusted courier bike across a latticework of frozen canals, tuning each repeater by hand. The sisters would shadow him, ferrying fresh lithium cells scavenged from defunct scooters. Otis would remain beneath the theater, nursing the backbone transmitter like a physician at a failing heart. 6 blocks west, in what had once been a co-working loft for tech startups, Task Force Zarya unfurled its own cartography of conquest. Major Svetlana Koroleova stood at the digital ops board, her face hooded by the blue glare of vector maps. A trinity of triangulation sweeps had already narrowed the rogue signal to a 1 square kilometer wedge between Rosa Luxemburg Platz and Torstrasse. That wedge housed apartment shells, a shuttered art cinema, a former microbrewery now commandeered for armored vehicle refits, and circled in red the Volksbund. Her operators favored the quick solution: storm the theater by dusk, sever the mast, parade the culprits on a live feed as a reminder that descent was a cul-de-sac. But Koroleova mistrusted quick solutions, not from mercy but from mathematics. The voice she pursued had become mythic in under a week. If the arrest felt messy, if blood pooled beneath camera lenses, martyrdom could metastasize faster than any virus. Better to capture the broadcaster silently, spirit her to a soundproof bunker, and replace her frequency with a soft counterfeit urging compliance. A blancmange of propaganda disguised as the original sweetness. Thus began the quiet hunt. Zarya units dressed in repurposed German rail uniforms, their sidearms sheathed beneath padded parkas. They drifted through cafes that no longer served coffee, lazy selling the story of routine infrachecks. At curb nodes they unloaded sensor pods, tripods no taller than a child that sniffed for RF harmonics like hounds in a hedgerow. Each pod fed location pulses to the ops board in the loft. Each pulse nudged the red wedge closer to the bullseye. Korolyova watched the incremental tightening with the patience of a jeweler winding a spring. By late afternoon, the snow thickened to a near whiteout, dampening even the growl of diesel trucks. Anya seized the weather as an accomplice. She and Otis emerged topside, cloaked in stagehand black, guiding a ladder onto the roof. Ice glazed every rung. Otis's gloves squealed against aluminum as he climbed. At the peak, Anya kneeled beside the tarp-shrouded antenna and threaded a fresh length of coaxial braid through its rusted grommet. Wind knifed her cheeks, flakes stung like ground glass. Yet when she glanced eastward, she glimpsed the Fernsaturm's silhouette, a gray lance piercing the cataract sky, and she felt impossibly tall. Back underground, while they stripped off soaked coats, Inga burst in breathless. Patrol vans had cordoned off Molstrass, engines idling. Operators unloaded sensor pods, their plastic hulls chalk-white against the drifts. Marta, tailing them from a ruined hostel balcony, counted 6 devices triangulating in unsettling syncopation. The grid was closing. Anya ordered an immediate shift to the emergency schedule. The main transmitter would dim for 3 hours, letting the repeaters shoulder the broadcast alone. During the lull, Otis would reroute the primary feed through a dormant fiber trunk once reserved for city festival lighting, bouncing the signal 3 kilometers south before it surfaced on the airwaves. If Zarya homed in on the original carrier, they would find only static and the damp smell of old timber. The plan demanded gear stashed in a U-Haul storage bay near Cottbusser Tor. Keller volunteered to fetch it, citing his forged rail credentials as a pass through checkpoints. He set off at dusk with Len riding shotgun. Night fell hard, a blackout without stars. Berlin's street lamps had been gutted for filament salvage years earlier. Only occupation floodlights remained, interrogating avenues with surgical beams. Keller and Len coasted along a bike lane that once pulsed neon pink. Now it was merely a moat of half-melted sleet. Near Moritzplatz, an armored troop carrier nosed through the intersection. Len's heartbeat hammered so loud he feared it would echo off the facades. Yet the turret never swiveled. The soldiers seemed fixed on their own internal coordinates, reading data shards on heads-up visors. They reached the storage depot without incident, jimmied the rusted latch, and dragged out a Pelican case of fiber repeaters. The return ride, though, unraveled quick. A street barricade, new since sunset, straddled the width of Prinzenstrasse, 2 troop buses nose to nose, spotlights raking the snow. It was a checkpoint masquerading as road repairs. Keller braked hard, the bike skidded. He whispered for Len to coast casual, present credentials, keep the exchange brief. Len swallowed, nodded, pedaled. The guard hailed them in accented German. Keller produced a Deutsche Bahn pass. The guard studied the hologram with bored suspicion, then asked why a rail inspector needed a Pelican case marked audiovisual. Keller's reply, some nonsense about platform PA malfunctions, rattled off his tongue too fast. The guard's eyes sharpened. He motioned to a nearby tech wearing an RF scanner. The device swept over the Pelican and screamed. Len reacted first. He unclipped a road flare from his belt, intended for emergency antenna repairs, snapped the cap, and hurled it beneath the nearest troop bus. Crimson phosphorus erupted, painting the snow in apocalyptic shades. Startled soldiers ducked. One fired reflexively into the flare's glare, muzzle flash strobing like paparazzi. Keller rammed the bike forward, shoulder-checking a guard, and vaulted over a pile of sandbags. Len followed, Pelican case slung across his back, bullets ticking like hailstones through the air. They cut down an alley spangled with icicles, hurdled trash bins, slid under a sagging chain-link fence. The checkpoint's shouting faded into the distance, yet the RF scanner had certainly logged the Pelican's emissions. Their anonymity was ash. News of the skirmish reached the Volksbund by burner phone minutes later. Anya listened, eyes closed, as Keller panted details. When the call ended, she addressed the room. We are exposed. If we scatter, they win by subtraction. If we stay, we risk the signal forever. Suggestions? Silence, broken only by the generator's arthritic cough. Then Marta, usually reticent, spoke, performed. They stared. She blushed but pressed on. The theater's main stage, though half-collapsed, still boasted intact catwalks and an ancient spotlight system wired to an auxiliary fuse box. What if they staged a phantom dress rehearsal, floodlights blazing, music bleeding from broken loudspeakers, drawing Zaria's attention like moths to a bonfire? Meanwhile, the real broadcast could relocate to an ice cellar under the Friedrichstrasse tram depot 100 meters away where Otis had once stashed backup tubes. Theaters, Marta said, were designed to misdirect the gaze. Let the occupiers storm the stage while truth slipped through the trapdoor. Anya's grin spread, ragged and bright. She had spent 2 decades living inside metaphors, now she would weaponize one. Preparations snapped into motion. Inga scavenged floodlight bulbs. Otis drafted a cable run through a disused sewer conduit. Len and Keller, limping from scraped knees, installed the fiber repeaters, configuring the hop schedule to mask any sudden amplitude jumps. Snow muffled their footfalls, but tension vibrated in every whispered syllable. Shortly before midnight, while wind scrawled curses across the roof, Anya stood again at the mic, this time in the ice cellar. The concrete chamber smelled of brine and mildew. Frost formed a halo around the tungsten filament of a single work lamp. She adjusted the gain, inhaled, and delivered the most audacious prologue of her life. She spoke not as a survivor but as a witness signing an affidavit for posterity. She recounted the day Berlin's last free newspaper shuttered, the hollow echo of presses silenced mid-edition. She described pensioners who tore insulation from condemned offices to patch broken windows, students who brewed soup from cemetery moss, engineers who rewired tram batteries into makeshift pacemakers for diabetic children. Her words circled grief but refused to drown in it. They beat like wings of migrating geese, tired, resolute, mathematical in their persistence. She concluded with a challenge: if you guard a checkpoint tonight, if you pilot a drone over these rooftops, remember, orders are not oaths. And a frequency is not a crime. Tune your heart, not your headset. She killed the mic. Across town, the repeater lattice caught her syllables, stitched them into a tapestry of voltage, and draped that voltage over half of Mecklenburg. Task Force Zaria received the transmission too. Sensor pods bloomed red across the ops board, confirming a triangulation cluster near Friedrichstrasse. Koroleova frowned. The location mismatched earlier data by several hundred meters. Possible error margin or deliberate relay? She dispatched an 8-man squad downriver, then ordered a second unit to advance on the theater regardless. Redundancy conquered riddles. The squad approaching the Volksbund found the facade ablaze with arc lights, silhouettes flitting across tattered velvet curtains. From within came orchestral crescendos, Mahler's Fifth, or a bootleg facsimile blaring at a decibel level bordering on blasphemy. The lieutenant barked for backup jammers, certain this was the broadcast hub. They breached the side door, envy goggles flashing. Smoke machines spewed glycerin fog, strobe lights convulsed, creating a zoetrope of refugee mannequins wired to sway on cables. In the frenzy, the soldiers unleashed tear gas canisters, only to find the stage props proved immune. Below their boots, the real culprits crawled through a drainage trench, hauling the core transmitter on a sled of auditorium seats. The sisters guided the load. Otis steadied vacuum tubes with gloved hands. Anya brought up the rear, whispering the tempo of her own pulse to quell panic. They emerged into a disused subway spur, rails glazed with black ice. Their Keller waited with a repurposed track inspection cart powered by scavenged hoverskate rotors. They heaved the transmitter aboard, clipped webbing straps, and engaged the motor. The cart glided into darkness, sparks flickering beneath its runners like the tail of a wounded comet. When dawn cracked, Task Force Zaria occupied a theater that sang only feedback whine. Its antennas had been decoys, soldered to nothing. Meanwhile, radios from Lübeck to Hanover crackled with Anya's encore, a recording of children reciting fragments of banned poetry stitched together with the static of northern gales. The sound was fragile, amateurish, and unstoppable. At the ops board, Koroleova swept cups of cold coffee into a trash bin. Her algorithm had underestimated art, how performance could masquerade as infrastructure, how a stage could swallow a battalion. She recalibrated, rerouted sat-tethered drones, and authorized wider comms blackouts. Yet even as she typed, she tasted a thrill she dared not name, the thrill of matching wits with an adversary who treated words like artillery. Anya, curled in the cramped quarters of the tram depot, sensed the shifting tide. Victory was not yet theirs. Each improvisation merely purchased another hour of free breath. Still, she allowed herself one sigh of triumph before sleep. For in that hour, thousands had heard unfiltered testimony, and testimony, once witnessed, multiplies like thaw water under spring ice, prying apart even the thickest frozen shells. The city dreamed that morning, and in its dream a single frequency threaded every apartment, bunker, and checkpoint, humming the fragile mantra, "If you can hear me, you are alive." Berlin's thaw, when it finally arrived, was violent. Ice that had welded doors shut for months cracked in a single sunrise, snapping roof tiles loose, sluicing gray meltwater into gutters that coughed like broken bellows. For the first time since the clandestine move to the tram depot ice cellar, Anya could lift a hatch and see daylight without risking snowblind. What she saw was at once miraculous and terrifying. Pedestrians again, their coats unbuttoned, faces tipped upward as though rediscovering the taste of light, and, threading through them, occupiers in lighter uniforms. Sensor wands hanging from lanyards like children's toys. Spring had exposed every hiding place, it would expose hers too. The transmitter cart, once tucked safely against a wall of rusting control panels, hummed at a higher pitch in the warmer air. Otis worried the filaments might drift off spec. He spent mornings recalibrating with shaking hands while Keller mapped new relay hops north toward the Baltic coast. Not far from Rostock, he'd whispered, an abandoned ferry terminal kept its emergency broadcast mast intact. If they could reach it, the signal would leap the sea, carrying truth to Denmark, Sweden, maybe even Scotland. They called the idea Project Lark after a bird whose song rose farther than its wings should allow. Project Lark required parts, surplus lithium packs, fresh triodes, a spool of low-loss cokes the diameter of a sailor's thumb. Len insisted he would steal a pallet from the rail refit yards outside Spandau where locomotive batteries were disassembled each week. His limp from the checkpoint chase was almost healed, he said, and the engine crews seldom searched kids in paint-splattered hoodies. Anya consented, though her stomach nodded. She had grown accustomed to the boy's grin flickering around corners, to the sisterly bickering that trailed him and Inga like a sitcom laugh track. Losing any of them now would hollow her more surely than shellfire. 3 days later, Len still hadn't returned. Major Svetlana Korolyova studied the boy through the one-way glass of an interview suite 4 levels beneath the Reichstag annex. He sat at the table's edge, jaw set with the stubborn courage of a street fox. His hoodie dripped river mud, someone had cuffed his injured knee too tightly, and blood soaked the gauze in a starburst pattern. Yet his eyes, huge behind chipped goggles, held a ferocity that unsettled the veteran interrogator assigned to break him. The boy's name, the interrogator reported, was Leonard Fisher. The surname was almost certainly false. Every second Berliner seemed to have adopted Fischer since the occupation began. The Pelican case he carried contained coke spools and frequency crystals identical to those scavenged from the Volksbund ruse. Under light sedation he had murmured a single plea, don't let them silence the voice. Everything else he refused, even water. Korolyova dismissed the interrogator and entered the room alone. She sat without her rank jacket, palms open on the table. We are both mathematicians, she told the boy in evenly cadenced German. You measure courage in beats per minute. I measure risk in data points per second. Let us trade numbers. Len shook his head, but curiosity flickered. She continued, confessing she once built pirate antennas herself in a different war, a different decade. She spoke of decibels, of standing waves bouncing inside alleyways, of the way a human whisper turned monstrous when layered over carrier hum. Len's shoulders loosened a fraction. That was when she offered the bargain, revealed a schedule of frequency hops, saved the sisters from an inevitable sweep, and she would ensure his own deportation rather than summary judgment. A train to Minsk beat a no-name grave under Friedrichstrasse. Len spat, a fleck of blood darkening the table's veneer. Music dies when cowards conduct, he rasped. Korolyova exhaled, feeling something inside her unclench. The boy's defiance answered a question she feared to ask herself. With a curt nod she left, scrawling a transfer order that posted him not to a tribunal but to a field infirmary, 1 week's stay for sepsis risk. Time, she hoped, for alternatives to bloom. Above ground she convened a crisis council. The transmitter had gone mobile, sweeps kept triangulating echoes that vanished like street magicians the instant drones banked for a closer pass. Occupation Command demanded escalation. Rolling RF blackouts, door-to-door raids, curfews so tight the city's pulse would stall. Korolyova argued for a subtler vector. Crush the flowers and the seeds scatter, she warned. Better to tempt the gardener into sunlight. Her superiors overruled her at noon. At 1600 hours, a proclamation echoed through every commandeered loudspeaker, amnesty for illicit broadcasters who surrendered within 48 hours, collective punishment for those who harbored them. In 21st century terms, collective punishment meant electricity quotas slashed, bread ration halved, relocation of security liabilities eastward. The text was acid in every ear. In the tram depot ice cellar, Marta counted seconds between sentences, tears standing on her lashes. Keller muttered curses in 3 languages. Otis wanted to pack and run. Anya listened until the feed cut, then rolled her shoulders like a boxer sizing a larger opponent. 48 hours, she said. That's the time they've given us. Let's use every minute. Project Lark became desperation's blueprint. The sisters would drive a commandeered ambulance, still sporting faded red crosses. The occupiers rarely stopped, north on the Autobahn night lanes toward Rostock, transmitter core padded between oxygen cylinders. Keller would ride shotgun, forging medical waybills for an outbreak of typhus that existed only on parchment. Otis would remain in Berlin, tending a decoy feed spat through a maze of subway repeaters. Anya would accompany the sisters, not as leader but as cargo, the voice itself. If captured, the rebellion lost its heart in a single intake of breath, yet without the voice, Project Lark had no purpose. She accepted the paradox the way actors accept stage fright, fuel disguised as terror. They departed an hour before curfew, ambulance lights dark, engine coughing through potholes like a smoker clearing his throat. Between ramparts of abandoned vehicles and gutted service stations, they threaded into the night. Once, near Furstenberg, a drone spotlight sliced the fog, but Keller gunned the accelerator as though rushing an arterial bleed. The drone banked away, uninterested in medics on urgent business. Behind them, Berlin endured its longest dusk. Apartments blacked out one by one, bakeries shuttered, tram overheads fizzed and died. Yet battery radios still crackled. Otis had woven a loop of Anya's earlier broadcasts, stitching them with newscaps from occupied Paris and Warsaw. The loop's timestamps were scrambled, making algorithms believe the signal leapt hours forward and back. Operators chased phantoms in 4 cities while the real mouthpiece barreled toward the Baltic. Korliova anticipated the decoy. She had asked herself, where would I hide? The tram network had been her top hypothesis since the theater stunt, its labyrinthine conduits perfect for ground loops. But when units sealed every substation from Gesundbrunnen to Neukölln, they found only kitsch postcards, half-eaten tins of pea soup, and a single handwritten note taped to a breaker panel. Truth is conductor, fear is current. The field captain radioed the quote upward, bewildered. She laughed, startling him. Still, data told an uglier story. Amateur radio enthusiasts north of the city reported a spike on exactly the frequency family she hunted. The lupus had left the den. She overlaid road access matrices, calculated likely routes avoiding checkpoints, and dispatched a light UAV pack along the A19 corridor. With thermal optics tuned low, even the exhaust heat of a diesel ambulance would flare like a comet in night vision. She did not tell command why her eyes stung when she keyed the launch codes. Rostock smelled of salt and engine oil, a ghost harbor where gulls wheeled over dry docks crammed with half-finished corvettes. The ferry terminal loomed like an unshelled cathedral, ribbed berth halls, ticket counters plastered with mildew, departure boards listing routes to Copenhagen that no longer existed. A shattered clock above Gate 4 had frozen at 1942 hours, perhaps the moment the last civilian ship slipped out before missiles closed the bell. They parked the ambulance beside a loading ramp crusted with barnacles and hurried inside. The sisters laid cable with the choreography of ballet dancers, unspool, clamp, secure, test. Keller climbed the mast's ladder, wind thrashing his coat, and bolted the dipole to a rusted crossbeam. 90 meters below, Anya stared at the sea. Somewhere across that darkness, people still believed Europe remained an idea worth uttering aloud. She inhaled brine, tasting possibility. Otis's voice crackled over the handheld, decoy holding, occupancy sweeps escalating, 2 drones heading north. Keller cursed, how soon? The answer was lost to static. Weather along the coast kneed the troposphere into chaos, but the meaning was clear. Seconds mattered now more than minutes. They finished the feed splice. The sisters powered up the rig. Voltmeters fluttered, stabilized. Keller triggered a carrier whistle. It shot up the mast, slipped over the horizon. Anya cued the first file, a mosaic of testimonies gathered for months, woven into a single oratorio. Farmers near Krakow describing scorched soil, a physicist from Toulouse explaining how fallout drift maps were censored, a nameless soldier whispering coordinates of mass graves in the Baia Luisa forest. Each voice layered atop the next until the borders between languages dissolved and only raw human timbre remained. She followed with live narration. Her throat burned from hours in the ambulance, yet the words fell true. We broadcast not to beg rescue but to remind the ocean that we exist. If freedom has forgotten us, let the sea carry a postcard to its memory. In Copenhagen, a retired telecom engineer tuning a homemade Yagi antenna stood bolt upright. On Bornholm Island, fishermen heard syllables bounce off cabin walls and cross themselves without knowing why. Receivers lit along the Kattegat like match heads in a velvet trench. Drones arrived before dawn. There were three, 2 rotary-wing scouts and a heavier tilt rotor armed with micro-guided rockets. They banked low, rotors shredding mist. The terminal's electricity grid had no radar. The alarm was the scream of gulls scattering. Keller skidded down the ladder, nearly breaking his ankle. Marta slapped the transmitter into shield mode, a Faraday coffin that halved range but might keep their coordinates vague for another sweep. Anya helped drag the battery trunk toward the ambulance. Waves slapped the keel of a derelict car ferry beside them as if urging flight. The first rocket hit the mast halfway up, severing guy wires with a flash that stunned vision white. Metal shrieked, the mast bent like a bow. Static roared in every earpiece. The second rocket dropped on the loading ramp, geysering rust and seawater, flipping the ambulance on its side. Keller was inside rewiring grounding straps. The concussion hurled him through the windshield, glass snowing around his limp form. Anya ran to him, boots skidding on diesel slick. Blood sheeted his temple, one pupil wandered. She pressed gauze, screaming for Marta's medkit, but the girl had vanished into smoke. Above, the tilt rotor circled for a kill shot on the transmitter coffin now exposed on the quay. Anya realized she might save the machine or the man, not both. She looked toward the sea, imagining the signal already winging across black water. Then she saw Len's goggles in her memory, fogged with pain yet fierce. She left the transmitter. She heaved Keller onto a dented shipping dolly, dragging him into the shadow of the ferry hull. The drone's searchlight pinned the coffin, fired a third rocket. When smoke cleared, burnt cable entrails smoldered like sea serpents. The drone tilted nose down, hunting heat signatures. Anya held her breath, Keller's blood soaking through her coat sleeve. A rifle crack rang from the terminal roof. The drone bucked, Euro whining. Another shot, then another. A maintenance catwalk 20 meters up revealed Inga, silhouette framed by sparks from a severed conduit. She was firing Len's old flare gun, loads swapped for improvised tungsten slugs. At such range and caliber she couldn't pierce armor, but she distracted optics long enough for the drone to misjudge altitude. Its wing clipped a lighting tower, rotors chewed steel, the craft cartwheeled into a dry dock with a roar like a collapsing cathedral. Silence, broken only by the hiss of burning composite. Inga slid down a mooring cable to ground, sprinted to Anya. Her cheeks were streaked with soot, tears cut pale rivulets. The backup drives, she gasped, I copied them last night, everything we recorded. They're on me. She patted the front pocket of her coveralls where a flash array bulged. Sirens wailed farther inland, armored columns inbound. The sisters could not carry Keller far, the ambulance was cinders. But inside the derelict ferry a service elevator still functioned, hydraulic lines blessedly intact. They wheeled Keller up the ramp into the car deck, sealing the hatch behind them with a welding torch Inga scavenged from the quay. When the hatch cooled, it looked untouched, a relic of a voyage canceled 2 decades ago. They cut power to every visible system, wrapped themselves in mylar blankets to scatter thermal signature, and waited. Outside, troop boots clattered, dogs barked, orders barked louder. Inside, heartbeat by heartbeat, Keller clung to a pulse as fragile as the last tube left unbroken. Dawn broke charcoal. Patrols withdrew after fruitless thermal sweeps, no radio pulses bled from the terminal ruins. They would chalk up the raid as success, confident the mast's destruction ended the pirate plague. In Berlin, occupation press officers drafted communiques claiming the neutralization of foreign-backed agitators. Loudspeakers announced bread rations would resume, curfew loosened slightly. The city exhaled a tired, unbelieving breath. In the ferry's hold, Anya finally dared power a handheld on its lowest setting. Static hissed, then miracle of miracles, a faint carrier wave at the far edge of the dial. Otis's voice whispered, storms fade. Stories do not. The decoy still lived, still weaving illusions. More astonishing, a second voice answered, crisp, Danish vowels threading English. We hear you, Berlin. Relaying north. Somewhere across the sea, Project Lark had found adopters. The files Inga saved would see the next blossom. Anya pressed the talk key, her voice scarcely above breath. Berlin copies. The garden grows. She pictured Len in a ward bed, defying interrogators with silence. She pictured Koroleova in her glass tower, realizing the signal's head had survived decapitation. She pictured a map of Europe pricked with new lights, like crocus buds forcing through frost. If the war was arithmetic of force, she would answer with geometry of echoes. Keller stirred, lucid enough to squeeze her hand. Outside, gulls returned, screaming triumph at the morning tide. They hid for 11 days inside the derelict ferry Jutlandia, listening to the Baltic gnaw at its rust-eaten plates. The car deck became a ward, a dormitory, a broadcast booth, and, on the worst nights, a chapel of doubt. Diesel fumes from the ruined ambulance seeped through bulkhead seams. Keller drifted in and out of consciousness, head cradled in Anya's lap while Inga counted morphine ampoules with a medic's grim precision. Marta rewired a jury rig of solar blankets and scavenged ultracapacitors to trickle-charge the handhelds. Outside, search patrols swept the docks at irregular intervals, boots clanging on gangplanks, muzzles tapping hatches. Each time, the sisters doused every spark of heat, and the fugitives held their breath until footsteps receded like waves. On the 12th dawn, a storm blew in from Skagerrak, hurling white knives of foam over the quays. The occupation patrol vessels withdrew to deeper water, even drones grounded in gales that slapped their rotors sideways. Anya took it as a sign. Keller, fever-broken but still weak, insisted they not squander the window. If Project Lark was to outgrow the ashes of the mast, the files Inga smuggled and the voice Anya carried must reach allies who could shield them. All roads south were nets of checkpoints, so they looked northward across 20 kilometers of ice-flecked sea to the Danish island of Falster, where an amateur ham operator named Rasmus had answered their scrambled hails. He claimed to command a clandestine ferry, nothing more than a barge with welded doors and an engine loud enough to wake saints, but he promised passage and a safe studio. Sound travels farther over water, he'd said. Give me one good vowel and I'll throw it to Iceland. Pairing the promise with reality required a vessel. The docks offered choices as bitter as spoiled fruit, a tug gutted of electronics, a police patrol craft with its ignition block welded out, a row of pleasure yachts whose fiberglass hulls had fissured and drunk the tide years ago. Marta found their salvation in a dry dock at the harbor's edge, a 60-foot pilot cutter, steel-hulled, mastless, engine intact beneath tarps of bird-stained canvas. Its name had flaked away with paint, only the registry letters MZ-13 survived. It would handle heavy chop if they could coax diesel from tanks long run dry and raise a stubmast for emergency antenna wire. While sleet rattled the dockyard corrugated roofs, they worked. Inga scrounged fuel from abandoned freezer trucks, siphoning kerosene into jerry cans. Marta spliced cokes through portholes, building a makeshift long wire that looped from stern rail to bow cleats. Anya sat with Keller in the cutter's galley recording fresh segments, reports smuggled from Berlin by Otis, testimonies emailed through onion-routed bursts by students in Prague who had resurrected comms towers of their own. She wove the clips with her narration, voice rough with salt air yet steady, and alto radar guiding ships through fog. Between takes, Keller coached her breathing, reminding the lungs how to pace a marathon sentence. Once he whispered, "Your pulse is the metronome of revolt," and fell asleep mid-smile. By dusk, the storm's tantrum had settled into a bruise-colored swell. They rolled the cutter down the slip with a rented manual winch, water climbing the keel inch by inch. Marta coaxed the engine, it coughed, shuddered, then found rhythm. Searchlight beams nicked the cloud ceiling inland, patrols still busy bulldozing rubble of the destroyed mast, unaware their quarry had grown fins. They cast off at high tide with no running lights, guided only by an old handheld GPS Keller balanced on his knees. Waves slapped hull plates like kettledrum mallets. Inga took the helm because she alone could read the channel markers half submerged in blown spume. Anya braced herself on the doghouse roof, hair whipping across her cheeks. She had never commanded anything larger than a stage ensemble, but as the harbor receded and the black immensity swallowed them, she felt an inheritance older than fear sink into her bones. A nautical knot of resolve carried by every exile who has ever dared water under hostile skies. Mid-crossing, the wind shifted northward, driving spray sideways. Radio discipline demanded silence, yet static ticked across the handheld speaker, ionospheric turbulence scratching Morse ghosts. Then, beneath the hiss, a pattern emerged. 3 slow pulses, 2 quick, 3 slow. SOS. Anya answered with her own sequence, trembling. A male voice flared thin, Nordic vowels warped by multipath, cutter MZ-13, maintain heading 265. Blue strobe on port in 2 minutes. They watched the dark until a pin of sapphire light winked and dipped behind a swell. 3 minutes later, the cutter's hull kissed the flank of a low barge, salt-rusted, its deck cluttered with crates that smelled of dried fish and diesel. Shadows hauled lines, boards creaked, a gangway dropped. Rasmus proved younger than Anya expected. 23, ponytailed, hoodie bearing a faded punk band logo. He greeted them with a toothy grin and mugs of scalding chicory brew. "Welcome to the Ugly Duckling," he quipped, patting the barge's railing. Beneath his levity-flickered nerves, he knew a single satellite blink could consign all of them to depth charges. He ushered Keller to a tiny infirmary in the fore-cabin, then led the sisters to an equipment bay glowing with LED strands. Racks of repurposed marine radios, Raspberry Pi clusters, and spool reel recorders lined the bulkheads. Over everything lay thick quilts to dampen RF bleed. "We broadcast at sea level," he said, "but the mast is the stratosphere." With a theatrical flourish, he flicked a relay, and a helium balloon the size of a van inflated on deck, hauling a wire dipole skyward until it vanished into murk 2 kilometers above. In Berlin, Otis heard the return of Anya's real-time voice 36 seconds later. He nearly toppled from his stool, laughter cracking the damp basement air. He patched her feed through every tunnel repeater still alive, then phoned Len's infirmary ward. 1 ring, then 2, then the line cut, but he knew the boy had felt the vibration in his pocket, the code for Songbird unharmed. Major Korolyova learned of the sea broadcast when a relay station in Gothenburg, recently seized by occupation Marines, flagged an anomalous burst on the contested band. Analysts produced direction-finding arcs pointing seaward. A vessel of unknown registry was singing revolutions somewhere beyond reach of coastal artillery. Command demanded artillery coordinates anyway. Korolyova argued for caution. Miss one shot over open water and Scandinavia's neutrals might protest, perhaps even intervene. Fury crackled through the secure channel, contain or be replaced. For the first time since she had donned her duty badge, she hesitated. The voice that haunted her sleep was no longer a local infection, it was airborne. To bomb it now felt like burning libraries to silence a single sentence. She drafted a contingency, allow the broadcast, but flood nearby spectrum with humanitarian announcements in German, framing the occupiers as protectors ferrying winter medicine to Danish hospitals. Spin the narrative before the narrative spun them. Her superiors accepted, propaganda was cheaper than ammunition. That night, as Anya read letters from refugees on Falster who had bicycled to the shore just to hear a stranger prove Europe still dreamed, Korolyova listened too, sipping tea gone cold. Between letters, the broadcaster quoted Hannah Arendt, "The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution." The line landed like a stone in the major's chest. Was she conservative already, steward of an empire sealing its own tomb? She shut off the speaker, but silence repeated the question. Falster's beaches filled with pilgrims, line cooks from Nykøbing, dockworkers from Vordingborg, students lugging battery packs and clunky field radios. They erected tent cities along dunes, sharing frequencies scrawled on cardboard placards. Each night Rasmus's barge anchored offshore, antenna balloon lofted, and Anya's signal painted auroras across the dial. She transformed the broadcast into a borderless agora. Baltic fishermen rang in with weather intel, Polish medics described clandestine vaccine corridors, a Finnish hacker collective uploaded de-encrypted occupation field manuals and read excerpts live. Marta mixed the feed like a DJ of defiance, weaving cello loops sampled from an old Sibelius record beneath testimonies so listeners could breathe between heartbreaks. The occupation regime answered with jammers, portable towers floating on buoys, spewing pink noise curtains. Rasmus retaliated by seeding a swarm of kite-borne repeaters that drifted where wind pleased, each one solar-powered, each one echoing the master feed on a slightly detuned carrier. The sea became an orchestra pit of rebel overtones. To silence one kite, the occupiers would have to net them all, and the nets tore in gales. Supplies, though, dwindled. Diesel for the barge, antibiotics for Keller's head injury, fresh food for the sisters who had subsisted too long on canned beans. Danish authorities sympathized quietly but dared not break neutrality overtly. Aid had to remain unofficial, packages ferried at night by local fishermen who risked seizure. One evening a boat failed to arrive, next morning its hull washed ashore riddled with bullet holes the size of fists. The message was clear. "We cannot stay static," Inga concluded. "Movement is armor." Rasmus proposed a bold pivot, sail west along the Gedser Trench, then turn south through the Fehmarn Belt and slip into the Kiel Canal, a waterway lined with enough bridges and towns to lose pursuit. At the canal's mouth, sympathetic dockers offered a warehouse wired for satellite uplink, a chance to bounce the broadcast directly to orbit beyond jamming. But the journey ran parallel to several naval garrisons. If the occupiers predicted their route, interception was certain. They debated through the small hours, blue maps spread across the barge mess table. Keller, propped on cushions, argued that risk's shadow fell longer the longer they lingered. Inga traced currents with a calloused fingertip. Anya watched their faces and felt something awaken, a director sensing final act cues. "We sail," she said. "But not all of us." A new plan unfolded, one that inverted every expectation. The barge would depart as scheduled, balloons stowed to look like a normal tramp freighter. Meanwhile, the cutter MZ-13, repaired, would set off an hour later on a divergent heading, broadcasting a decoy feed at maximum wattage, Anya's pre-recorded monologue looped with auxiliary files. The occupiers would chase the familiar voice south into open sea. The real barge, disguised under tarp mosaic nets, would hug Danish inlets, silent until well inside the canal, where a burst transmission would announce survival. To sell the ruse, the decoy cutter needed a convincing crew and, above all, the voice on board. "I'll helm the decoy," Anya volunteered. Protest erupted, Keller weak, the sisters aghast. But she spoke over them. "I was always the bait. I chose theater, now theater chooses me. If my capture buys you enough horizon to outpace shadow, do not waste the dawn." Her smile was fragile but unshaken. "Besides, they won't kill the voice. They'll parade it." Keller understood, propaganda prized trophies. Rasmus insisted on joining her two voices, harder to muzzle. Finally, they drafted a compromise, Anya and Rasmus on the cutter, Keller, Inga, and Marta on the barge with the archive drives. They hugged silently beneath wintry stars, salt-crusting tears they pretended were spray. They launched at civil twilight. The cutter raised a jury-rig of canvas around aluminum poles, engine chugging loud as a brass band. "Let them hear our heartbeat," Rasmus joked, though his knuckles whitened on the wheel. Anya triggered the transmitter, feeding it the recorded loop spliced with live interjections so surveillance AI would register vocal variability. Within 30 minutes, jammers pivoted, UVs banked. A corvette broke anchor from Warnmund, prow knifing waves in pursuit. Radar pings bloomed around the cutter like angry fireflies. Aboard the disguised barge, Keller watched dots migrate on a smuggled AIS tablet. When the corvette crossed the 5-kilometer threshold, he exhaled, hook set. They swung west, engine muffled, hugging shoals so shallow naval drafts dared not follow. On the cutter, the chase became visceral. A rotary-wing drone arrowed overhead, its camera pod swiveling. Rasmus pushed throttle until pistons sounded ready to tear free. Anya stayed at the mic, narrating the sea as though reciting a love letter. Whitecaps rise like battlements, gulls wheel like searchlights, and somewhere behind this horizon beats a second heart. She hoped the sisters heard, felt bravery rather than goodbye. 30 minutes later, a warning shot arced, shell detonating 50 meters off port, showering the deck with brine. Rasmus throttled down, surrender posture. Patrol skiffs closed, rifles level. Officers climbed aboard, helmets lacquered with salt spray. Anya raised her hands, voice hushed soft. "I surrender, only airwaves, never the tide." They bound her wrists with plastic ties, but one officer, brows knit, ordered careful handling. She was, after all, the prize. Cutter engines were cut, tow lines secured to the corvette. As the steel monolith hauled them south, Anya caught Rasmus's eye. He winked. Hidden under a deck plate lay one final contingency, a time-fused charge rig to the cutter's fuel tanks, set for 2 hours, long enough to place distance between corvette and barge, short enough to deny the captor's reverse engineering her gear. She prayed the blast would scuttle only empty hull and ego, not flesh. Far north, the barge entered the Kiel Canal at midnight rain, cranes looming like skeletal guardians. Dockworkers loyal to the underground flagged them past a derelict checkpoint, guiding lines beneath sodium lamps. Inside a warehouse draped with tarpaulins, they erected the satellite array, an actuated dish once used for luxury yacht IPTV, now communion wafer for rebel scripture. Marta booted the uplink computer, IP lights winked green. Keller, still bandaged, set gain levels. Inga opened the final dot wave. Anya's live feed had gone silent. They filled the gap with the roar of waves and a single spoken line pre-recorded by the actress hours earlier: "If my voice ceases, borrow it." In a modest flat in Edinburgh, a retired BBC engineer muttered about bloody time and routed the signal onto a dormant DB subchannel. In Reykjavik, a public station did the same. By sunrise, truckers in Norway tapped their dashboards as a woman they'd never met reminded them borders were lines taught to children, not laws of physics. The cutter exploded off the coast near Usedom, 300 meters astern of the corvette. Blast petals of orange and iron tore the night, pressure waves rattled portholes. The prize had self-immolated. Officers raged, but the prisoner was already miles away, transferred to a coastal black site before detonation. There, in a concrete room, Major Koroleova removed Anya's restraints and poured 2 porcelain cups of tea. "I could claim you're beaten," Koroleova said, "but every jammer we deploy births 10 more receivers." "Explain." Her voice bore exhaustion, not malice. Anya sipped. The tea tasted of smoke. "Truth is a migratory species," she replied. Clip one wing, the other learns to ride different currents. Silence settled, heavy as silt. Finally Koroleova spoke almost to herself. I once believed data shaped outcomes. Then I watched data lie. Your broadcasts frighten command because they unmask numbers with names. She slid a photograph across the table. Len, hospital gown, knee-heeled, sitting under guard but reading a book. This one refuses to speak except in mathematical proofs. He wants you to know pi is non-terminating, therefore hope ought to be. Anya laughed, a sound half-wind, half-water. He quotes George Cantor under interrogation? The boy is unstoppable. Koroleova's shoulders slumped. Defeat can resemble relief. She produced a blank flash stick. Record a message telling fighters to lay down arms. I'll arrange your freedom in exchange. She waited, knowing refusal was certain, wanting confirmation. Anya looked at the plastic rectangle, then at the major. You underestimate theater, she said softly. The role chooses its ending. Koroleova closed her eyes. When she opened them, something bright had burnt away. She moved to the door, spoke to the guard. Interrogation concluded, subject remains in solitary. Medical inspections daily. She paused, glanced back. Voices require breath. See that hers remained steady. The guard saluted. Once alone, Anya exhaled, feeling neither victory nor fear. She had traded ocean for stone, but the echo carried. She could feel it humming in her lungs. Somewhere satellites pinged, kites fluttered, bridges vibrated with hidden wires. The geometry of echoes no longer needed her, but it would remember. 7 weeks later, a convoy of civilian lorries crossed from Denmark into Germany under international Red Crescent banners. In the lead cab, Inga adjusted a radio dial. A faint signal threaded static, the laugh of a woman known to millions yet held by none. Behind the convoy, Danish television aired images of mass protests in Copenhagen demanding Berlin's occupation authorities release political detainees. Among the placards, one slogan appeared in 4 languages: If you can hear me, you are alive. Otis, now steward of the Baltic Network, broadcast the slogan hourly, overlaying it on readings of clandestine school roll calls, on lists of hospital shortages, on lullabies. Len, freed in a prisoner swap, Koroleova had quietly engineered coded compression algorithms that let whole libraries slip through kilohertz cracks. Keller recorded again, his voice baritone steel, narrating supply routes he no longer had to hide. And Anya? In a cell whose walls sweated salt from the sea winds that seeped through ventilation shafts, she closed her eyes each night and imagined ripples. She sang softly to herself, rehearsing stories she would tell when doors opened, as doors inevitably do under the solvent of time and song. Guards paused outside, listening despite orders, unsure whether the language was German, Danish, or simply the grammar of endurance. The world had not rebuilt. Tanks still scarred boulevards, treaties still bled at their signatures. But across a dozen frontiers, voices crisscrossed the ether, each carrying a shard of the mosaic. No single jamming tower could darken every shard, no single arrest could hush the choir. In mathematics, Anya once read, resonance occurs when a system receives energy at its natural frequency, oscillations amplifying until structures crack. She smiled in the dimness, tapping the concrete floor like a conductor setting tempo. Somewhere above, antennas vibrated at the frequency of human stubbornness. Crack long enough, she thought, and even empires fracture along unseen seams. Outside, dawn pressed pink against the window slot. Far away, a kite reeled skyward, copper wire glinting. A child turned a radio knob. A heartbeat rode the carrier wave. And the cold ether warmed.